So welcome today to NOA's English Cafe, and we will be going over past perfect tenses. So let's begin. Let's look at the structure of past perfect. You have subject, had, verb 3, a noun, time frame, before, after, and then you're going to have your second event. Here's an example. Mike had eaten lunch 3 hours after the meeting. Now, if you look, let's break down in our past perfect tenses and let's look at what are some of the most important aspects that come with developing this sentence structure. You have subject, verb 3, noun, time frame, and a second event. So let's look at the next thing that we really need to know when using this is when to use before versus after. So let's look at when to use before. When you're supposed to use before is a key structure because it can change the meaning of your sentence completely. When the first action in the time is before the second action in the sentence. When this happens, you're going to always use before and you won't use after. This is extremely important. Begin because it could change your sentence structure. So let's look at when you're supposed to use after. Now, when you use after, it's the exact opposite. When the second action in time is before the first action in the sentence, that is when you're going to use after. So let's take a little time and let's look at example of a great sentence structure that we can have in a situation. Okay, so here's our example. Here we have Coach Lindsay. We're going to use her as our example today. In the morning, Coach Lindsay loves and she meditated at 6:30 a.m. After meditating, Coach Lindsay, she went ahead and she decided that she was going to have breakfast at 8:30 a.m. Now make sure you understand that the first action was meditation at 6:30 and the second action was her breakfast at 8:30. Now let's look at the first action. Okay, so we have the meditation at 6:30, breakfast is at 8:30. Before event, then the second event. So it's Lindsay had meditated 2 hours before she ate breakfast. Now let's look at when we use after. Second event, then first event. Lindsay had eaten breakfast 2 hours after she meditated. Make sure that you also see that we use eaten as our verb 3. We also made sure that the second event in both sentences, you're always going to use verb 2. Another key aspect to this type of sentence when you're dealing with past perfect is that you're always going to have before or after. You won't use when, you're not going to use and, you're not going to use then. Now there are sometimes you can use options for your time frame. The time frame in a sentence is when Lindsay ate breakfast, it was 2 hours, and you could say before or after she had meditated. You don't need the time frame. Things you don't want to do is put exact times. The 6:30 a.m. and the 8:30 a.m. You don't want to say that specifically in when you're using perfect tenses. So let's look at this on a graph. So we have our future, a now, and our past. We're going to make sure you understand how this is happening in a timeline. So the first event you have is meditated. Then she ate 2 hours later. She ate breakfast. That's going to be your second event. So you see the first event is first. The second event is second. In a time length. We're talking about in time how we order each event. This is extremely important to understand because when you're using perfect tenses, the focus is on the connection of the two events, not the time that they happen. So we don't care about 6:30 a.m. We don't care about 8:30 a.m. We care about the time between meditating and eating breakfast and which event came first and which event came second. So we won't ever use 6:30 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. in past perfect tenses. You'll use those for past simple tenses if it's needed. You could say, Coach Lindsay meditated at 6:30 a.m. Then she meditated at 8:30 a.m. That is past simple, but not past perfect tense. Okay. Let's look at another example. And this time we're going to add a little quick quiz of multiple choice so that you have an opportunity to figure it out. Mike and Lindsay, they danced at 5:30 p.m. So this is going to be our first event. It's going to be 5:30 p.m. when Coach Mike and Coach Lindsay were dancing. The second event, it's going to be very important that you get this order structured right and that you make sure that you have that down clearly. The second event is Mia sang at 8 p.m. at night. That's your second event. So now let's take a nice look at this. The structure. You have your subject, had, verb 3, noun, time frame, before, after, and second event. First event, Mike and Lindsay danced at 5:30. We want to use before. Mia sang at 8 p.m. and we want to use before to structure the sentence. So let's look at a couple of options that we're going to do for our multiple choice quick quiz to make sure that you understand exactly how to use past perfect tenses. So we know that we have to put the first event first in the sentence. We also know that we have to put the second event second in the sentence in order to use before. So the first one, Mia had sung 2.5 hours before Mike and Lindsay danced. Other option, Mia sang 2.5 hours before Mike and Lindsay danced. Then we have Mike and Lindsay had danced 2.5 hours before Mia sang. So we see B wasn't correct because B had the second event first and we had the first event second, and that's not how you use before. Remember, you have to make sure that this is important, that you put the first event first and the second event second if you're going to use before, or it's going to get your events completely mixed up. So now we have A, C, and D is none of the above. Okay. So look at A. Mia had sung 2.5 hours before Mike and Lindsay danced. So if we look, the problem with that was, once again, it had Mia singing first and Mike and Lindsay dancing afterwards. And it needs to be turned the other way around because we already know Mike and Lindsay had danced 2.5 hours before Mia sang. We know Mike and Lindsay dancing was at 5:30. So that's the first event. We know Mia sang at 8 p.m. We know that's the second event. We want to use before because we want to focus on Mike and Lindsay dancing, not Mia singing. So that's why we would use before. And when we use before, we're going to really want to make sure that we have the right events in the right orders. Because once again, if you don't, it could become very confusing when you're speaking in perfect tenses to an individual and they want to know the timeline of what happened first and what happened second. When you do this and you do it in the wrong way, you will often see that it's going to sometimes make the sentence completely the opposite of what you mean. So that's why it's so important. Also, if you look, when we used our verb 3, we had danced, okay? And this is also very important. And we added in this sentence 2.5 hours. So now let's look at after. We have Mia had sung 2.5 hours after Mike and Lizzie danced. Mia had sung 2.5 hours, then Mike and Lizzie danced. Mia had sung 2.5 hours when Mike and Lizzie danced, and none of the above. So this is confusing because all three have Mia, the second event, going first and the first event going second. So that structure is correct with all three options. But there's some things that are different. The difference is A had, B doesn't have had, and it also has been, and also C has had, but it does have wind. So please remember, this is very important. When you're using past perfect tenses, you always need to make sure that you have had in your sentence. So because of that, we already know that the answer cannot be B. Okay? It can't be C either because we had then and not after or before. So the answer has to be A. Okay? So let's recap our lesson today. Okay? Things that you really want to make sure you remember. Most mistakes are happening when people use past perfect because they often forget to use subject, had, verb 3, how to use before and after, and to make sure never use your exact times. Okay. You also, when you're using your past perfects, you want to look at irregular verbs and your verb 3s because if you use the wrong verb, it can also become very confusing. And if you forget to use had and you use a verb 2 and you still try to use the past perfect tense, then you can have another problem, which it's going to sound very confusing because you're attempting to use past perfect, but it's going to sound like you're using two past simple sentences. Okay. Thank you for today for listening, and please watch our other videos and continue this course on perfect tenses.
Aha! And home.